Between 2015 and 2023, house prices in the EU have soared by nearly 50% on average. But some countries are facing a full-blown house price explosion. Take Hungary, where prices have skyrocketed by 172%. The Czech Republic's not far behind with 111%, and house prices in Portugal are up 106%. Meanwhile, property prices in the Netherlands and Poland are both up around 80%. So, what's driving these massive surges? And what does it mean for someone trying to buy a house or an apartment today? And what creative strategies are some people turning to find a place that they can call home? Keep watching, because Europe's housing crisis is more complex than you think. Today on Espresso Economics, we're going to talk about a hot-button issue for thousands, if not millions of people across Europe, the housing market. So we know that house prices have been going up and up. The big question is, why? Well, the issue doesn't have one single cause, but it's due to a combination of factors. Here are the main ones. First, there's a mismatch between where people want to live and where housing is widely available. More and more people want to live in cities where jobs and opportunities are, compared to rural areas where housing is cheaper and more widely available. However, many European countries just haven't built enough homes to keep up with growing demand in cities, and this has created a real pressure on urban housing markets. This increased demand for urban properties, combined with a lack of supply, has caused prices to go up. There is also the impact of monetary policy, or what you might better understand as interest rates. For much of the past 15 years, interest rates in Europe have been at a very low level. This was necessary to help stimulate the economy through the financial crisis and the pandemic. But these low interest rates made mortgages more affordable, pushing up demand for homes and helping to drive prices higher. Another factor has been inflation in the cost of building. In 2025, the European Central Bank, ECB for short, published a report which showed how construction costs had risen sharply during and after the pandemic. And when houses and apartments become more expensive to build, they become more expensive to buy. Economists also point to the role of investor activity in the housing market. Big corporate investors like investment and pension funds have invested heavily in residential property in high-demand areas in search of stable returns. This blog from the ECB found that when these big investors purchase residential properties, house prices rise and stay elevated for an extended period. There's also the impact of smaller private investors buying properties for short-term tourist rentals. This has had an inflationary effect on house prices, particularly in cities like Barcelona, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, where housing is already in high demand. Now you might be wondering, how much different is it for this generation to get on the property ladder compared to previous generations? Well, for baby boomers and Gen Xers, buying a home was dramatically more affordable. Here's why.
So one way of measuring this is by looking at how many years of average income does it take to buy the average house. In the 70s and 80s, in many European countries, this was like 2 or 3, meaning your income of 2-3 years, you could just buy a house. That number has increased now to something around 6, reaching even 8 in some big cities, meaning that it takes a full 8 years of the income of a whole household, which is usually a couple, to buy a house.
So, we know that buying a house in Europe has become out of reach for many young people today. But what are the implications of having a whole generation potentially locked out of the housing market? Well, for previous generations, buying a home didn't just mean getting a place to live. It also meant wealth accumulation. It was the main way these generations built financial security. For today's generation, this path to financial stability is effectively blocked. This has created a growing divide between generations that could have serious long-term consequences. Listen to this.
So having a whole generation locked out of the housing market can have many negative implications for the economy and for society. It's hard to tell right now because there are still 20-30 years before this generation gets to retirement, but we could end up with a generation that retires with much less wealth than the generations before, which could raise questions about retirement preparedness, about their ability to smooth out shocks and so on.
Now you might be thinking, won't this generation eventually inherit their parents' wealth? Well, yes, this might be the case for some, but it does nothing to fix the housing crisis or help young people get on the housing ladder.
The problem is that this wealth usually comes too late, so it comes when people are 55, 60, 65 years old, so they have already taken their life decisions in terms of jobs, forming a family, and so on.
So, if you would like to try and buy a house in the next few years, I'm sure you know the drill. Maximize your income, save hard, and try to scrape together that all-important deposit. But what else should you consider? And what creative strategies are some people turning to find their own place? Now, before we start, we want to make one thing clear. These tips are not solutions to the housing crisis. But right now, here are some ideas that might help. First is to check what first-time buyer supports are available in your country.
There are a lot of public support programs in different countries, whether to get subsidized mortgages, subsidized savings, subsidies when you form a family and you want to move. So informing yourself of those and really taking advantage of those it's a no-brainer, but sometimes people are overwhelmed with information, so informing yourself about that is good.
For example, in France, if you're on a moderate income, you can access 0% interest loans to purchase your first home. Ireland has a Help to Buy scheme, which gives first-time buyers a tax refund of up to €30,000 to help with the deposit for purchasing or building a new home. You might also have access to another first-time buyer support, BOMAD, the bank of mom and dad.
Certainly, if you have someone in the family, if your parents can help either with a down payment or by signing on your mortgage, that's certainly something to do, but of course we are aware that that's not the case of everyone. Well, some people, they will be able to benefit from that, some cannot.
Here's something else to consider when trying to buy your first home: house hacking. House hacking is a strategy where you use your home to generate an income that offsets your living costs. It's something for younger buyers to consider because it can help you get onto the property ladder faster and reduce the burden of a mortgage. Renting out a spare room in your house or apartment to generate extra income is a good example. The good news is that in many European countries, including Ireland, the Netherlands, Spain and Portugal, income from renting out a room is taxed at a lower rate, or not taxed at all. Now, of course, this approach assumes you've already managed to save for a deposit and get a mortgage. But if you're in that position, it's a great way to reduce your monthly costs. Remember when I said earlier that there was a mismatch between where housing demand is and where the houses actually are? Well, this has created a situation where housing is much cheaper and more widely available in rural locations compared to cities. In fact, it might be hard to believe, but you can actually buy a house in rural villages in France or Italy for as little as €1. Now, if this sounds too good to be true, you're right, there is a catch. These homes usually require significant renovation. However, there might be grants and low-interest loans available to help you cover renovation costs. So, if you're a remote worker and open to the idea of rural living, this might be an opportunity worth exploring. Finally, the housing crisis has forced some people to consider shared home ownership. Housing cooperatives, or co-ops, have become more common across Europe. Here's how it works. You and the other residents collectively own and manage the property. You pay an initial fee to join the co-op, and the group shares maintenance costs. Housing co-ops are common in countries like Sweden and Switzerland, but the housing crisis means the movement is now expanding to places like France and Spain. It's a more community-focused way to secure affordable housing and could be worth exploring if you're open to the idea of shared ownership. So, now we want to hear from you. What's the housing market like in your country? And what do you think needs to be done to fix Europe's housing crisis? Let us know in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching and see you next time.